Okay, have you ever felt like your brain just took a vacation without you? Like it's just overloaded,
Yeah.
can't focus, stuck in a mental rut?
Yeah, it's almost like you're running on fumes mentally and physically. And I think part of that is just we are bombarded with constant information and stimulation these days.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Hmm.
Um, you sent over some really interesting material on the power of our thoughts, specifically Dr. Caroline Leaf's work on detoxing our brains from what she calls toxic thinking.
Her approach is really interesting because she really marries science and spirituality together. And it's not just, think positive thoughts and you'll have a great life, but she actually breaks down the biological processes of how our thoughts impact our emotions and even our physical health.
And she identifies 12 areas of what she calls this toxic thinking. She calls them the dirty dozen. They can really seriously impact our lives. And we're talking about things like toxic thoughts, toxic emotions, words, even toxic dreams.
It's so true. And think about how many times you've replayed a hurtful conversation in your mind or dwelled on a past mistake. These seemingly harmless thought patterns can trigger a cascade of stress chemicals in our bodies.
Oh, it's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Exactly. And Dr. Leaf explains that these toxic thoughts don't just stay in our heads, they actually have a real impact on our physical well being. She uses this analogy of a checking station in the heart, which is constantly evaluating the messages our thoughts are sending.
So it really is a whole body experience, not just a mind game.
Absolutely. And take stress, for example. It's not just a feeling, it's an actual physiological response. And when we're bombarded with these toxic thoughts, our bodies go into that fight or flight mode, releasing hormones like cortisol.
And too much cortisol over time is really damaging, right?
Definitely chronic stress has been linked to everything from heart disease and immune system dysfunction to digestive issues. And it's really interesting. Dr. Loof cites studies showing how stress can actually shrink the parts of our brains responsible for memory.
Oh, that's a little scary. So what can we do about it? Are
Actually,
we just stuck being victims of our own thoughts?
not at all. And that's the really empowering part of Dr. Lee's message. She actually outlines a 5-step process for detoxing our brains. It's called Gather, Reflect, Journal, Revisit, Reach.
Okay, break that down for me, this 5-step sequence.
Sure. So each step builds upon the last. And so the first is gather, and this is where we gather information through our 5 senses. Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell.
So it's about being aware of what we're even letting into our minds in the first place.
Absolutely. And then the next step is reflect. So we take that information and we consider, is it positive or negative? Is it truthful or distorted? Those kinds of things.
So gather is awareness, reflect is evaluation. What about journal?
Journaling helps us to really process these thoughts and emotions.
Yeah.
It's about making them tangible and seeing the patterns in our internal landscape.
Journaling can be so powerful.
Yeah.
What about revisit? Does that mean going back and rereading what we've written?
Yes, revisit is where we look back at what we've written, reflect on those insights, and really identify the areas where we might need to challenge or reframe our thinking.
So we've gathered information, reflected on it, journaled about it, revisited our thoughts. What's that final step? Reach.
Reach is where we turn those insights into action. It's about actively changing our behavior, breaking free from those toxic patterns, and cultivating healthier habits.
So it's not just thinking differently, it's actually living differently.
Precisely. And Dr. Leaf really emphasizes that this is an ongoing process. It takes time and effort to detox our brains and create lasting change.
This is great. I love this 5-step sequence. It's so empowering to know that we actually have the ability to change our thought patterns and to
Yeah.
improve both our mental and our physical health.
It is empowering. And it's fascinating how Dr. Leaf blends scientific research with biblical principles. And she really demonstrates how faith and neuroscience can work together to transform lives.
So before we go into those specific dirty dozen areas, can you explain a little bit more about the science behind how our thoughts actually create physical changes in our brains and bodies?
Yeah. So every thought triggers a cascade of electrical and chemical activity in our brains. And this strengthens specific neural pathways, making us more likely to think those thoughts again.
So the more we think a thought, the more ingrained it becomes.
Exactly like a path in the woods. The more you walk it, the more defined it becomes. And the same thing happens with our thought patterns. But the challenge is that toxic thoughts, they trigger the release of those stress hormones that can really have a detrimental effect on our bodies over time.
That makes sense. So how do we actually start rewiring those pathways and breaking free from those toxic thought patterns?
Well, that's where Dr. Leaf's 5-step process really comes in. By consciously choosing to focus on more positive and life-giving thoughts, we can literally retrain our brains and create new, healthier neural pathways.
I'm starting to see how this deep dive can be a game changer for our listeners.
Yeah,
It's not just about feeling better. It's about understanding the science behind our thoughts and taking control of our mental and physical well-being.
absolutely. And Dr. Leaf's work offers this really compelling blend of, science and practical strategies that can help us all live healthier and more fulfilling lives. Are you ready to dive into some of those dirty dozen areas and, really explore how we can apply these principles to some real life challenges?
Let's do it. I'm ready to unpack some of those toxic thought patterns and help our listeners detox their brains and reclaim their mental and physical well-being. Okay, so let's tackle some of these dirty dozen toxic thought patterns head on. And I think the first one, toxic thoughts themselves, is something that probably a lot of us struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a meta-toxic thought, right? Toxic thoughts about toxic thoughts.
Exactly. But it's a perfect starting point because recognizing those negative thought patterns is really the first step towards changing them.
And Dr. Leaf emphasizes, that even seemingly harmless thoughts can become toxic if we dwell on them for too long.
So give me an example. What does that look like?
Sure. So imagine you make a mistake at work. A non-toxic response would be to acknowledge the mistake, learn from it, and then move on. But a toxic thought pattern might involve replaying that mistake over and over in your mind, beating yourself up and catastrophizing about, all the potential consequences.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there. That kind of negative self-talk can really spiral out of control.
It can, and that's why Dr. Leaf encourages us to challenge those negative thoughts and replace them with more positive and realistic ones.
So how do we actually do that? How do we stop that negative tape from playing in our heads?
Well, that's where that gather, reflect, journal, revisit, reach process comes in, right?
Yeah.
So first, we become aware of the toxic thought, gather. Then we reflect on it. Reflect, we ask ourselves, why am I thinking this? Is it true? Is it helpful? And then we write it down. Journal. This helps us to process the thought and gain some perspective. And then we revisit what we've written, revisit, and finally we take action to change our thinking reach.
It's like we're putting those toxic thoughts on trial, examining the evidence, and then issuing a verdict of not guilty.
I love that analogy, and Dr. Leaf emphasizes that it's not enough to simply stop thinking negatively. We need to actively cultivate a more positive mindset. And she talks about, really replacing those toxic thoughts with positive, life-giving ones.
So let's move on to another dirty dozen area, toxic emotions. So how do they impact our well-being?
Well, toxic emotions are those negative feelings that we allow to fester and control our lives. Things like anger, resentment, bitterness, fear, guilt, shame. They all fall under this category.
And just like toxic thoughts, these emotions can trigger a stress response in our bodies, right?
Absolutely. When we experience these emotions, our brains release hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, putting our bodies into that fight or flight mode.
And we know that can be so damaging if it becomes chronic.
Exactly. And Dr. Leaf highlights something really fascinating. She says that our bodies actually store emotional memories.
Wait, really? How's that even possible?
It's pretty incredible. She explains that our cells have this kind of memory. They can actually hold on to the emotional residue of past experiences. So even if we've consciously moved on from a traumatic event, our bodies might still be carrying those emotional scars.
That's mind-blowing. So how do we release those trapped emotions and heal from past hurts?
Forgiveness is key. Dr. Leaf emphasizes that forgiveness is not about condoning bad behavior. It's about freeing ourselves from the grip of those toxic emotional memories.
I can see how holding on to resentment and bitterness would really keep us stuck in that cycle of stress and negativity.
It does. Forgiveness allows us to break free from that cycle and move forward.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about toxic words. I think we've all been guilty of saying things that we later regret. How can we detox our language and speak more positively?
This is so important. Dr. Leaf points out that our words have incredible power. They can build up or tear down both ourselves and others.
Yeah, there's that verse in Proverbs, the tongue has the power of life and death.
Exactly. And Dr. Leaf encourages us to be mindful of our language and to choose words that are encouraging and life-giving.
So it's about being intentional with our speech thinking before we speak, and really making an effort to use our words to spread positivity, not negativity.
Yes, and it's not just about what we say to others, it's about how we talk to ourselves, too.
Oh, that's a good point. We can be our own worst critics.
Absolutely. And practicing positive self-talk and speaking to ourselves with kindness and compassion is so crucial.
So let's dive into toxic choices. How do our past decisions impact our present reality?
This is where Dr. Leaf's concept of the toxic pathway comes in. She explains that, our past choices, particularly those made in response to stress or trauma, they can actually create neural pathways that make us more likely to make similar choices in the future.
So we can get stuck in a rut of unhealthy decision-making.
Unfortunately, we can, and those choices can have a ripple effect, impacting our relationships, our health, our overall well-being.
So how do we break free from that cycle and start making healthier choices?
Well, self-awareness is crucial. We need to recognize the patterns in our decision-making and identify those triggers that lead us to make unhealthy choices. And Dr. Leaf suggests, asking ourselves some questions. What am I feeling when I make this choice? What are the consequences of this choice? Is there a healthier alternative?
Those are some great questions to consider. It's like becoming a detective, investigating our own behavior.
Exactly. Once we understand the why behind our choices, we can start making different ones. And Dr. Leaf also emphasizes the importance of seeking wise counsel, from trusted friends, mentors, or therapists to help us navigate those challenging decisions and make choices that really align with our values.
It's reassuring to know that we're not alone in this journey, that we can reach out for support and guidance when we need it.
Absolutely. Speaking of support, let's talk about toxic dreams. Dr. Leaf's work in this area is fascinating. She explains that our dreams can actually reveal areas of toxicity in our lives.
Really, I always thought dreams were just kind of these random firings of neurons.
They can be, but Dr. Leaf suggests that our dreams can also act as a kind of internal guidance system, highlighting areas where we might need to do some emotional or mental house cleaning.
So our nightmares might actually be trying to tell us something.
They might be, and Dr. Leaf encourages us to pay attention to recurring dreams or nightmares as they might be pointing to some unresolved issues or areas of stress in our lives.
That's so interesting. I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to my dreams now. What should we do if we start noticing recurring themes or disturbing imagery?
Well, Dr. Leaf recommends journaling about our dreams, exploring the emotions they evoke, and considering, the potential messages they might be conveying.
Journaling, again, it seems to be a central theme in Dr. Leaf's work.
It is. It's such a powerful tool for self-reflection and insight. And in the case of toxic dreams, journaling can help to unlock those hidden meanings and provide a deeper understanding of our subconscious minds.
Okay, next on the Dirty Dozen list, toxic seeds. So what are they and how do they impact our lives?
Toxic seeds are unresolved hurts or traumas from our past that we haven't fully processed or healed from. These can range from childhood abuse or neglect to betrayal by a friend or loved one.
And these toxic seeds can have a really lasting impact on our mental and emotional well-being.
Absolutely. They can lead to feelings of insecurity, unworthiness, fear. They can sabotage our relationships and prevent us from living full and joyful lives.
So how do we uproot these toxic seeds and reclaim our emotional health?
Well, forgiveness is crucial here as well, and Dr. Leaf emphasizes that forgiveness is not a one-time event, it's an ongoing process.
You mean we might need to forgive someone or even ourselves multiple times for the same hurt?
Exactly, and it's important to remember that forgiveness isn't about condoning bad behavior, it's about releasing that toxic grip that those hurts have on our lives.
Holding on to those hurts would keep us tethered to the past, preventing us from fully embracing the present.
It does. Forgiveness allows us to break free from those chains and move forward with a lighter heart.
So let's talk about toxic faith.
Yeah.
This is a topic that I think might resonate with a lot of our listeners. So how can our faith become toxic, and how do we restore it to a place of health and wholeness?
Well, toxic faith often stems from, negative experiences within religious institutions or with individuals claiming to represent faith. It can manifest as, a fear of God, a sense of unworthiness, or a belief that we're flawed or broken.
I can see how those experiences would really distort our view of God and our relationship with Him.
They can, and Dr. Leaf encourages us to examine those beliefs, challenge those negative messages we might have received, and reclaim a faith based on love, grace, and acceptance.
So it's about separating the true essence of faith from those distorted perceptions that we might have picked up along the way.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember that God's love is unconditional. We don't have to earn it or prove ourselves worthy.
That's a powerful message. It's like we're invited to come to God, just as we are with all of our imperfections.
We are. And when we embrace that truth, we can heal from those toxic faith experiences and build a relationship with God that's based on trust, love, and acceptance.
Let's move on to toxic love.
Yeah.
How can something that's meant to be so positive and life-giving become toxic?
Well, toxic love often shows up in relationships that are, imbalanced, controlling, or abusive. It can involve, a fear of abandonment, a need to please, or sacrificing our own needs for the sake of the other person.
So it's like a distortion of true love, kind of a counterfeit.
It is, and Dr. Leaf emphasizes the importance of setting healthy boundaries in our relationships, learning to love ourselves, and recognizing that true love is based on mutual respect, trust, and freedom.
Toxic love can be so insidious because it often disguises itself as something good and desirable, but ultimately it's about control and manipulation, not genuine care and affection.
You're absolutely right. And Dr. Leaf encourages us to ask some tough questions about our relationships. Are we giving more than we're receiving? Are we constantly walking on eggshells? Do we feel safe and respected?
Those are important questions to consider. It's like we're taking inventory of our relationships and making sure they're genuinely nurturing and supportive, not draining and destructive.
Exactly. And if we find that a relationship is toxic, Dr. Leaf encourages seeking professional help, whether it's from a therapist or a counselor, to help us navigate those challenges and create healthier dynamics.
We don't have to stay in toxic relationships. There's help available, and we deserve to be treated with love and respect.
We do. Speaking of love and respect, let's talk about toxic touch. It's a sensitive topic, but a crucial one to address.
Absolutely. How can touch, which is meant to be so comforting and connecting, become toxic?
Well, toxic touch is any form of physical contact that is unwanted, uncomfortable, or abusive. It can range from inappropriate sexual advances to physical violence.
Sadly, this is an issue that affects far too many people.
It does, and Dr. Leaf emphasizes the importance of setting clear boundaries when it comes to touch. She encourages speaking up if someone's making us uncomfortable and seeking help if we've experienced any form of abuse.
It's empowering to know that we have the right to say no to unwanted touch and that we don't have to suffer in silence.
You don't. And Dr. Leaf also highlights the importance of healthy, appropriate touch. She explains that touch is actually a fundamental human need and it plays a vital role in our emotional and physical well-being.
So things like hugs, cuddles, hand-holding those can actually be good for us.
They can. Dr. Leaf explains that those kinds of touch release oxytocin, which is a hormone that promotes bonding and reduces stress.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So while we need to be aware of the potential dangers of toxic touch, we shouldn't shy away from healthy, loving touch.
Exactly. It's all about balance and discernment.
Okay, let's move on to another dirty dozen area. Toxic seriousness. How can being too serious be harmful?
Well, Dr. Leaf points out that while it's important to take life seriously, it's also essential to cultivate a sense of playfulness and humor.
Yeah, I can see how being too serious all the time would make us really rigid and inflexible.
It can, and it can also lead to chronic stress and burnout.
How do we loosen up and inject more fun into our lives?
Well, Dr. Leaf encourages us to engage in activities that bring us joy. Spend time with loved ones, laugh, often make time for hobbies and interests that light us up.
It's like giving ourselves permission to be silly and carefree, to embrace that lighter side of life.
Exactly. And Dr. Leaf emphasizes that laughter is incredibly therapeutic. It releases endorphins, reduces stress hormones, and it boosts our immune system.
Love that the next time I feel myself getting bogged down in seriousness, I'm going to make a conscious effort to find something to laugh about.
I think that's a great idea. Laughter is truly the best medicine.
Okay, let's move on to the final dirty dozen area, toxic schedule. This is something so many of us struggle with in our fast-paced, overscheduled lives. So how can our schedules become toxic, and how do we create a more balanced and healthy rhythm?
Well, Dr. Leaf explains that our bodies have this natural rhythm, and when we're constantly pushing ourselves beyond our limits, we disrupt that rhythm, creating this state of chronic stress.
Oh yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
I often feel like I'm running on a hamster wheel, never quite able to catch my breath.
I hear you, and Dr. Leaf encourages us to be more mindful of our schedules, prioritize rest and relaxation, and learn to say no to commitments that drain our energy or don't align with our values.
So it's about setting boundaries, being intentional with our time, and making sure we're not overcommitting ourselves.
Exactly, and Dr. Leaf also emphasizes the importance of incorporating activities that promote relaxation and stress reduction into our daily routines, things like, yoga meditation, spending time in nature, listening to calming music. Those can make a huge difference.
I love that it's like we're giving our brains permission to chill out for a bit, to step off that hamster wheel of constant doing and just be.
Exactly. And when we create that space, we allow those positive emotions, love, joy, gratitude, to come to the surface more easily. It's not about denying the challenges of life. It's about equipping ourselves to face them with greater resilience and peace.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm feeling so inspired to take action and start detoxing my brain. I feel like we've covered so much ground unpacking each of these dirty dozen areas. But what really stands out to me is this underlying message that we actually have a choice in all of this. We're not just passengers along for the ride.
Right, you've hit the nail on the head. One of the most empowering takeaways from Dr. Leaf's work is that we have far more control over our thoughts and our brains than we often realize. It's like We've been given this incredible toolkit, but we haven't really been shown how to use it effectively.
And if we can learn to use those tools, if we can detox our brains from all this toxic thinking, what does that actually look like in our everyday lives? Is it about, trying to be happy all the time?
That's a great question. I don't think it's about forcing some kind of artificial positivity or pretending that challenges don't exist. It's more about creating a mental and emotional environment where, the good stuff can flourish. And Dr. Leaf talks about building mental resilience. And that really resonated with me. The more we practice catching those toxic thoughts early on and challenging them, the stronger our mental immune system becomes.
So it's less about, constantly battling negativity and more about building up our capacity for joy and peace and all those good emotions.
Precisely. And that's where this whole concept of love comes into play. I know it might sound a bit cheesy, but Dr. Leaf presents some really compelling research on how powerful love is for our brains.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Hmm.
Tell me more about this love-brain connection.
Well, remember how we were talking about dopamine earlier, that neurotransmitter that makes us feel good? Well,
Yeah, I did.
love is a major dopamine trigger, and it doesn't have to be romantic love, feeling loved by family, friends, even your pet. All of these experiences, they light up the reward centers in our brains.
Oh, that makes so much sense when I feel genuinely loved and supported. Everything just feels a bit brighter.
Exactly. And Dr. Leaf dives into the science behind this. Love actually reduces activity in the areas of our brain that process fear and anxiety. It's like a natural stress reliever built right into our biology.
I love that love is a brain hack.
Right. And there's even more to it. We talked about how toxic thoughts create those harmful pathways in our brains. Well, love actually does the opposite. It strengthens the connections between neurons, which boosts our cognitive function and makes us more resilient in the face of challenges.
So love is literally brain food. I'm getting it. But I think a lot of people, myself included, we struggle with, feeling overwhelmed by the demands of daily life.
Mhm.
Life just feels like go, go, go all the time. How do we even make space for love and connection when our schedules are bursting at the seams?
That's such a real struggle for so many of us. And Dr. Leaf addresses this head on. She talks about something called busy rush syndrome, which is essentially when our nervous systems are stuck in overdrive because we're constantly bombarding them with stress and stimulation.
Busy rush syndrome. Yep, that's me on more days than I'd like to admit.
It's so common in our culture. And the thing is, being busy doesn't automatically equal productivity or fulfillment. In fact, when we're chronically stressed, our brains simply don't function at their best. We lose focus, creativity, and even our ability to connect with others in meaningful
So
ways.
what's the antidote? How do we escape this busy rush and create more space for the good stuff?
Well, it all comes down to creating balance. Dr. Leaf emphasizes the importance of intentionally building relaxation into our lives. And I'm not talking about, needing to book a week-long vacation, although those are lovely too. It's more about incorporating small, consistent practices that help to regulate our nervous systems and calm that overactive stress response.
Give me some examples. What are some of those small practical steps that we can take?
Well, think about things like deep breathing exercises, spending time in nature, listening to calming music, or even just taking a few minutes to unplug from technology and be fully present in the moment. Even 5 minutes of intentional relaxation can make a huge difference in how you feel throughout the day.
It's like we're giving our brains permission to chill out for a bit, to step off that hamster wheel of constant doing and just be.
Exactly. And when we create that space, we allow those positive emotions, love, joy, gratitude, to come to the surface more easily. It's not about denying the challenges of life, it's about equipping ourselves to face them with greater resilience and peace.
This has been such an incredibly insightful and empowering deep dive. I'm feeling so inspired to take action and start detoxing my brain from all the mental junk food and really cultivate a more loving and peaceful mindset.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. We're all works in progress, and there will be days when those toxic thoughts creep back in. But the more we practice these tools, the stronger we'll become in recognizing them and choosing a different path.
You've given me so much to think about. It's a powerful idea. What if instead of letting our brains run on autopilot, we were intentional about choosing thoughts that actually fuel our well-being and create a more loving and fulfilling life?
That's a wonderful thought to leave our listeners with. What if we could literally train our brains for love, for joy, for peace? It's an exciting possibility and one that's within our reach.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey exploring the power of our thoughts and the potential for transformation that exists within each of us.
The pleasure was all mine, and to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic. Dr. Leaf's work offers a wealth of insights and practical tools, and we believe that by applying these principles, you can experience greater peace, joy, and well being. Remember, you have the power to detox your brain, cultivate love, and create a life that is truly extraordinary.